Well, good morning and welcome to International Women's Day and this webinar on gender parity. This is the first in a series of Women on Track webinars which we're going to be hosting during 2016, and of course I'm sure there's many of you who are aware of Women on Track, and this is an initiative which we've started to help to develop high potential women and keep them in the workforce. So we're delighted to have so many people registered here today and to have such a range of diverse organisations represented. So it's good to have you all with us. Now, we'd very much like to have interaction during the session and discussion, because if you think about it, we're going to be together for 45 minutes. We've got quite a large number of people joining the webinar, and if you think about the collective years of experience, expertise and knowledge that you have, then it amounts to quite a lot. So let's share that knowledge during the discussions. What I'd like to do first of all, before I introduce our two speakers, is to put some context around International Women's Day. And I guess the question to answer is, what is International Women's Day all about? And I think it means different things to different people in many ways. So it's an opportunity to align and promote relevant activity. It's a celebration, obviously, of what women have achieved. And it's also, and probably most importantly as far as I'm concerned, it's a call to action, particularly this year, to help achieve gender parity and accelerate gender parity. And what I'd really like by the end of this webinar is that everybody has some action, whether it's personal, whether it's organisational, to help achieve that gender parity, to do their bit in achieving it. So we're celebrating today the role of women, their economic, their social, their political contribution. And really, if we think about it, we've come a long way. If you consider that in the UK, it's only actually 88 years since women first got the vote. And by comparing ourselves to other companies, we've done pretty well, because if you think, for instance, Switzerland, women only achieved the vote in the 70s, and actually in South Africa, for some parts of the population, women didn't get the vote till the 90s. So we've achieved a lot, but we need to do more. And at Davos, in the recent World Economic Forum last year, we were told that the rate of achieving gender parity is slowing, and that it's quite a frightening statistic that they don't feel that the gender gap will actually close until 21,033. Now, my maths isn't very good, but that seems a long, long way away. So what can we do to help to bridge that gap and make this happen, this gender parity happen much sooner? So what I'd like to do is to introduce the first of our speakers, and the first speaker is Liz Codd. Liz is Head of Talent Development at Fidelity Investments. She has a wealth of experience, and her particular focus today is going to be on coaching and how coaching can help women achieve gender parity.
Thanks very much, Rosie. And hello, everybody. It's great to be invited to participate in this webinar. I've been looking forward to it. A little nervous, but looking forward to it. So yes, I look at coaching as a methodology that is focused on enabling high performance, whether that's in individuals or teams. And those individuals can be men or women, obviously, and many of the barriers to high performance, I think, are actually gender neutral. But today we're talking about women, so I'm going to focus on women and how to help women achieve high performance and to truly realise their potential. And in my experience of both coaching and mentoring women, I have noticed there are a few things, a few barriers to high performance that tend to arise more often than they do perhaps with men. So one of those is the fact that I think women are really quite eager to please. And sometimes that results in them not being too assertive and ending up being either passive or aggressive when they're under pressure. and obviously I'm generalizing to make the point. Also, I see women being quite sensitive to negative feedback and sort of anxious about their performance. Sometimes lacking confidence, even though they're extremely competent. Sometimes discounting their own opinions and deferring to other people. And in talking to my colleagues here at Fidelity, they talk about what they find difficult about medium-sized or large groups and how difficult they find it to bring their opinion. And sometimes not wanting to attract attention to themselves in that way by perhaps offering a different point of view. And then finally, I think sometimes struggling to communicate in a compelling way, which sometimes is just through a lack of preparation. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about two things. One is what I call impact, and the other I call contribution. Okay, so some of you may have come across Sylvia Ann Hewlett, who is the founder of the Centre for Talent Innovation. You can see the slide there. And Sylvia created a think tank in 2004. She wanted to focus on changing the face of leadership and to help create conditions that empower women and other excluded groups to sit at decision-making tables. And she wrote this fantastic book called Executive Presence, which I can highly recommend, and some of you may have read, some of you may have it on your bookshelves. And she talks about the fact that there's a gap between a woman's capabilities and the success that she achieves. She's done lots of focus groups and surveys, so she bases everything that she publishes, she bases on data. It's not just her opinion. And what she says is executive presence, or what I have called impact, is about your image. It's not about the substance. It's not about your capabilities. It's about your image. And it's about what we signal to the world rather than what we actually achieve. So it's not a measure of performance. It's a message to, whether it's our colleagues, our bosses, about who we are, how we expect to be treated, whether or not they should listen to us or take notice of us or give us the credit that we deserve. And she has divided executive presence and articulated it across these three things that you can see on the slide. How you act, which she calls gravitas, how you speak, communication, and how you look, appearance. And what she says is the good news is that executive presence or impact can be learned. So it's not something you're born with, you can learn it. And in the book she gives you lots of hints and tips as to how to go about learning to improve your executive presence. So when working with women who are particularly eager to please, moving on to being eager to please, sometimes this is to the detriment of the impact and contribution that they can have. And so I coach them around how they see themselves, and I explore with them whether their identity is based on how others see them or how they see themselves. And sometimes I've found that women allow the opinions of others to define who they are, and partly, as I say, it's about being eager to please and seeking approval. And I have a little analogy that I use sometimes, which is it's a bit like you're a boat on a rough sea, and each time you experience some kind of positive or negative feedback or approval or disapproval, it's like the wind and the waves impacting on the boat, and the boat goes up and down and backwards and forwards. And so that's a bit like our confidence levels fluctuating, and one moment feeling really great and having lots of confidence, the next moment perhaps feeling a bit insecure and having some self-doubt. None of this is to do with actual ability or actual strengths and actual skills. So what to do about it and where to start? So firstly, I think it's important to define ourselves, and this is what I help my coaching clients to do, and without reference to other people's views and wishes. So one example I often come up with is a rock. So I think that a rock has many attributes, and they're not all positive, but the positive attributes of a rock are things like substance and solidity, standing firm in the face of adversity and wind and rain and that kind of thing, opposing forces. And as I'm talking, you may have your own image in mind of how you would like people to describe you. So I get my clients to define themselves, come up with words that describe who they are when they're at their best, and then we work towards those traits and those attributes so that they become the reality of what other people see and the impact that they have. sometimes I find that it's actually fear that stops us being truly who we are and who we want to be. And so I will often use a sort of classic coaching question, which is, what would you do if you had no fear of the outcome or consequence of your actions? And that has the effect of really releasing people from the fear. And I ask them, what's the worst thing that could happen? And for most of us, we don't work in life or death type situations, so the worst thing that can happen is probably that we lose our job or something like that, which is obviously not good. But when you talk about these things and you face up to them, they suddenly have so much less power than they did when they were something that was sort of in the back of your mind and you hadn't really thought it through. So then what we do is we do think each of the worst case scenarios through, and I help them to do that and say, okay, well, if that did happen, what would you do? How would you deal with it? And we figure out all of the options and choices that then that creates. And then we move on to saying, okay, well, what are you going to do and when are you going to do it, and what help might you need from somebody else to achieve what you want to achieve? So that's thinking about being eager to please, seeking approval, and defining ourselves and really trying to be that person and show that person to the world so that that's what other people see. Now moving on to another thing that I think is quite true of all human beings, actually, which is we all want to be liked. I don't think there's many people who don't want to be liked. And for some women that I coach, that gets translated into being unwilling or unable to express their opinion, particularly if it's different from somebody else in the room. And as I say, that can often be in a sort of medium to large groups. Sometimes we fear being put on the spot, being challenged, not being able to respond, not being credible in our response. And therefore our contribution is weaker than it needs to be or could be. It doesn't reflect our true capabilities. So in these kinds of situations, my coaching approach is really to focus on preparation and practice. What I do is encourage the client to come up with all of the opinions that they have on whatever the topic is in question. And we do lots of rehearsal. So we clearly articulate their views and turn it into something which is succinct and compelling. Lots of role play, lots of rehearsals, and thinking through what objections might other people come up with who are in the room and how would I respond to them. So I do think that actually to be able to think on the spot requires lots of preparation, which is perhaps not something that's intuitive. And thinking through all of what we do, what our opinions are, and handling objections is something that takes time, and having a coach to help you do that is really, really useful. And the coach can bring different perspectives as well, because sometimes we end up thinking about things in the same way, and having somebody who's got a counter viewpoint or counter perspective can be really, really helpful. So I call this a thinking partner, and having a thinking partner makes it much easier to figure out what you do think about things. And I'm going to come back to thinking partners towards the end of what I've got to say today. And I would say that over the course of our work and our careers, we tend to get into habits in the way that we think or the way that we do things, and they can sometimes be bad habits. Obviously, we can have good habits, but we can also have bad habits in the way that we think about things, the way that we approach things. And this, again, is an area where I find myself coaching people a lot. There's a really, really great approach that's based on neuroscience called positive intelligence, and it was developed by a chap called Sherdad Shamin. I hope that's how you pronounce his name. He lectures at Stanford University, and he has been an executive coach for many years, and he has coached CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And you can go to his website and you can take this test, and it will tell you what your bad habits of thinking might be. And those bad habits of thinking will be sabotaging you. And so he calls them saboteurs, and he has 10 that he's identified. So they're habits of thinking that we've developed over the years to protect ourselves in some way. But generally speaking, the circumstances around the requirement to protect ourselves have gone, but it's become a habit. So whilst they're no longer needed, we no longer need to protect ourselves, we've developed a habit of thinking, and actually those habits become unhelpful and they hold us back. So some of the saboteurs are things like, he gives them a name, so all of 10 of them have a name, things like avoider, or pleaser, which is one of the ones I've talked about today, so this desire to please people to the detriment of ourselves. Another one is controller. There's a stickler, and I have to confess that that's one of my saboteurs, is I'm a bit of a stickler, which is a perfectionist, which doesn't make it much fun for the people I work with and live with sometimes. Another is a hyperachiever, or hyper-rational, somebody who over-rationalizes things, and judge. And he says that everybody has a strong judge, and that's judging ourselves, judging other people. So in my coaching, I encourage my clients to think about thinking, to become aware of their thinking patterns. And we work on replacing some of the bad habits that they've developed over the years into good habits, so replacing them with good habits so that they are not held back by those thinking patterns and they can achieve their full potential. So before I wrap up, I just want to make a suggestion. Not everybody can have a coach, but a really great alternative is one of these thinking partners. This is someone that you can choose who has your best interests at heart, someone who's going to help you to prepare for difficult situations, or will help you to try to do things in a different way, whether that's the way you behave or the way you speak or just how you come across to other people. You're more on the being end of things. And then you can reciprocate. Together then you challenge each other and encourage each other, support each other, give each other feedback, and over time build confidence as a result. And if you want to try new ways of operating, it's best to practice in a safe environment. And a thinking partner, that person that you trust, can provide that safe environment and help you to be brave and try, as I say, try things that are different and new and perhaps feel uncomfortable. So before I hand back to Rosie, if you would like to know more about thinking partners, I'm happy to offer everybody a free coaching session with me. Please feel free to get in touch through LinkedIn, and I'd be delighted to meet with you, spend time with you either on the phone or face-to-face. But I'd be really interested to hear what you think about what I've said this morning, and so, I look forward to the discussion. So thank you, Rosie.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that. I think some really useful nuggets which can help us to deal with some difficult situations. And I think particularly for me, I really liked what you said about the importance of practice, because I think certainly I have experienced that feeling of what you say in your head is very different to what you say out loud. So for me, I think that's really one to take away. And I also love the idea of a thinking partner as well. So some really, really useful tips and advice there from Liz. So let me now introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker is Kate Gibbs. I know we had on our information we sent out to you, Ria Ingleby was due to join us. So she was going to be speaking about the subject of well-being. But unfortunately, poor Ria has been taken ill. She has lost her voice, so she was unable to join us. But as part of our Women on Track series of webinars, we will be hearing from Ria later on in the year. So to replace Ria, we have Kate Gibbs, and Kate is previously had a long and very glittering career at Barclays in senior roles. And she is going to talk to us about the subject of unconscious bias and how we can deal with that in the workplace. So welcome to Kate.
Good morning, everybody. I want to start this morning by just sharing a story with you. And this is from about 12 years ago when I'd just been promoted to being a regional director within the bank that I worked for. And I was attending a first meeting with the life assurance division. Now, the regional and national members of this team were all male, as were the rest of my peers in this division of the corporate bank. Now, as I attended the meeting, I walked into the room and there were 8 of us attending the meeting, but around the table there were only 7 chairs. I entered the room, I wasn't known to the life assurance team and I was ignored, so I carried on, undeterred, and went to pull in a chair from the side of the room to join the table. And as I moved it into a gap, a gentleman to my right said, "Are you minute taking?" Which threw me somewhat, and I was slightly dumbfounded. So in response, I said, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I think this was really an attempt just to buy myself some thinking time to produce a fabulously witty retort. So again, he said, "Are you here to take the minutes?" Now, I'll tell you how I responded later, but what I'd like to spend the next few minutes exploring is something that you may have come across, and it's called unconscious bias. And really just to share some thoughts on how we can manage ourselves in response to that. Now, as Rosie said, my background is in financial services, and like most people, I have experienced unconscious bias as I've worked my way up the career ladder. I now work as a consultant trainer for OnTrack, so I try to support and develop women and men to achieve their career aspirations. What I'd like to talk about is what unconscious bias is and how it can affect women in the workplace, given that this call is all about gender parity, and what we can do to handle it. So first of all, what is unconscious bias? Well, it's present in just about every area of our life. It's how we choose the person that we start a conversation with over coffee whilst we're waiting for a training course to start. It's why some people might cross the street to avoid the youth in the hoodie who is approaching us. Because although we like to think of ourselves as open-minded and objective in how we evaluate others, extensive research has shown that our beliefs and our values are very heavily influenced by a lifetime of experiences, our family, our culture. So, in other words, we tend to like people who look like us, who think like us, and are from similar backgrounds. These thinking patterns, which we develop over time, they help us to process information quickly and efficiently, which is great for our survival. But in business, it can be a factor which can be quite costly, because it can cause us to make decisions which are not objective, and we therefore might be missing out on opportunities. Now, unconscious bias is not limited to gender parity. It can be linked to ethnicity, sexual orientation, socio-economic groups. So just to give a very generic example, there's a great story about a gentleman called Joshua Bell. Now, he is a world-renowned musician, and he set up at a metro station in Washington one day, and he played some of the finest classical pieces on one of the world's most expensive violins. He was disguised as a street performer, and he was only acknowledged by just a handful of the 1,000+ people who passed him by. He made a total of $32.17 in the 43 minutes of performance, and yet 3 days before, he had filled the Boston Symphony Hall, where seats sold for $100 each. So was this an example of unconscious bias towards street performers? Maybe they just didn't like his music. But either way, how many times are talented people rejected from interviews due to the preconceptions of the interviewers? So how can this affect women in the workplace? We've already heard that we are quite a long way from gender parity. Could the reason behind this be unconscious bias? And not just that of men, like the gentleman in my story at the beginning, but of women about themselves. Liz has shared with us some examples of how some of her coachees have had to work on their self-limiting beliefs in order to progress and realise their potential. And I think with relatively few women in senior positions across many organisations, it would be quite easy to understand how women's unconscious beliefs about career advancement could be holding them back. Now, unconscious bias can take a variety of forms. It can lead women to assume that they maybe need to exhibit more male, in inverted commas, characteristics. In fact, there was a Harley Street HRT consultant a few years ago who confirmed that he had prescribed testosterone to some female MPs, not that any of them have ever admitted to it, but he said that they wanted it because it made them more assertive and feel more powerful. Or, in another example, it can cause women to doubt their strengths and their abilities, just as Liz has already described. So what can we do about this? Well, if I go back to my story, which was a classic unconscious bias by that gentleman, that as I was a young female in the room at that time, that I must be there in a secretarial capacity. Now, I responded by introducing myself and giving my title and saying with a smile, and that's the important bit, oh, you'll be asking me to pour the tea next, because I've always found humour to be quite effective in those situations, and it did diffuse it, but nonetheless make the point that I had a different role. How best to respond? It is a difficult one because, as Liz has mentioned about our tendencies towards passive and aggressive behaviours in some cases, what can happen is that our default responses start to fight their way forward, and it's quite tempting to react with a really cutting answer which highlights and shames the perpetrator of the unconscious bias. However, this is likely to lead to a chain of negative outcomes such as embarrassing the individual, and it can cause other people to perceive us as aggressive. It's far better to be proactive and to choose an assertive response. Now, unconscious bias won't always be as overt as it was in my story. It can be more subtle. And we know that being assertive is about balancing our courage to speak our mind with consideration for others. And I think that developing assertive behaviours is absolutely essential to our ability to manage unconscious bias. And this includes giving feedback when it's appropriate about specific behaviours which have affected us. So being very clear on what the actions or the behaviours were, what the impact was, how it's made us feel, and what we would prefer to happen next time or desired change. I think as managers we have a different responsibility, which is ensuring that we have got really robust recruitment, talent and promotion processes which involve a range of individuals to just ensure that all candidates are matched to a really clear set of requirements and just reduce the risk of that unconscious bias from creeping in. And we need to be aware of our own unconscious bias and try to move away from any which might be unhealthily influencing us. And I think then it's about being proactive in the way that we present ourselves. Now, as a young female in a very mature and heavily male-dominated environment, I took the decision to develop a persona at work to be taken seriously, again in inverted commas. I think what I did was exactly what Liz described with the executive presence, although I didn't realise that at the time. But I did give thought to how I looked, how I spoke, and how I acted. And I think women have been doing this for years. I mean, where do you think shoulder pads in the 80s came from? Yep, it was all about power dressing, because in that decade, women were re-entering the workplace, and that was a particular tactic that some of them used. So I did make changes to the way that I looked, spoke and acted, but then I used what I would describe as the ultimate secret weapon, which was that I got results. I'd taken over a region which had been 7th out of 7, and after a year we were 3rd, and within 18 months we had gender parity across the 12 area manager roles that we had within the region. So we had a 50-50 split, and within that we had 2 single mothers who were doing a job share area manager role. Between them they managed 24 relationship staff. So I think that we really did manage to stop the brain drain by demonstrating that we had flexible approaches to working patterns. We had some people on term time contracts, and that really paid dividends to us. So before I hand back to Rosie, I think I'll just conclude by saying that we all have unconscious bias, and I think the challenges for us all are to become more conscious of our own biases and move away from these if they're potentially damaging, to be assertive if experiencing unconscious bias and to give specific and timely feedback. And I think another thing to do is to look for a role model, and if there's no one suitable, then I think we need to become advocates for ourselves. Margaret Thatcher was once asked if the male MPs made any concessions for the fact that she was a woman. And she replied by saying, well, no, why should they? I don't make any concessions for the fact that they are men. And I just think that's such a great mindset. She really saw herself as an equal to be judged solely on her performance, because I think what really matters most is how we see ourselves. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Kate. Again, some very, very interesting points, and the points you made about courage and consideration, absolutely right in terms of helping us to deal with bias. So thank you for all those points. Again, you know, I think it's so useful really just to take time and just to think about how we behave as individuals and how we can use some of those ideas, those tips that you've so eloquently described to us. So you've heard from Liz, you've heard from Kate, and I'd now really love to see if any of you have questions that you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to make on the subjects we've been discussing today. So if you could press the hand up icon, and then we can bring you into the discussion. You have your hand up there. Do you have a question, Krista?
I do, yes, thank you. Thanks to Liz and to Kate for brilliant presentations. They're really, really helpful. I was just wondering if Kate has heard of Project Implicit. It's a sort of survey with Harvard that you can go online and take a test, which is all about unconscious bias. So, you know, it sort of covers all different areas. And I just wondered whether that's something that other people have used, or perhaps referred to it for managers to use, because it does seem to be quite detailed. But again, I think, you know, it's quite practical and helpful to understand. You know, as you said, everybody has different biases, and understanding your own is really helpful.
That's really interesting to know that. I haven't come across that Project Implicit, but I will go online and have a look at it, because I think the more insight that we can get on this, the better, because the whole thing about unconscious bias is it moves us towards people as well as moving us away from people. And I'm sure you've heard of the phrase that people tend to recruit in their own image, and if we're not aware of these things, we can suddenly find that we've surrounded ourselves with a team of clones almost, and it's good to have that variety and recognise that we need a good mix there. So I think anything that raises our awareness about what our bias might be is really helpful. So no, I've personally not come across that, but I will have a look for it. Thanks, Krista.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Krista. Yes, I too will be going to the website and looking at that one, because I think, as Kate so rightly said, the more we understand ourselves, the more we understand other people. So I think we have another question from Susie Every.
Thank you. I've enjoyed both immensely. The positive intelligence, is that the same sort of thing as the thinking errors, the negative thinking errors?
It's not. It's not quite the same. I think we had a leadership event a couple of years ago, and we had Rolf DeBelly make a presentation all about thinking errors, and that's things like the sunk cost fallacy, which is actually quite hard to say, where you've already spent money, and so you carry on spending money and throwing good money after bad. And that kind of thing. So it's not quite the same thing. The thinking errors are, I don't know how to describe them actually, really, but things that you think make sense until you actually stop and look at them, whereas the positive intelligence, it's much more about patterns of thinking that you've developed over time that end up not being helpful. At one point in time, they would have been helpful for you, but that point in time has passed, but because you've created a habit, they stay with you. And actually, you need a different way of thinking about things to ensure that you're successful or realise your potential. So they aren't the same kinds of things.
Okay, thank you. And my only other question is, how do the group feel about women who are prone to crying? And I'm not one of them, and I know that that's the bias I have. I'm turned off immediately that someone starts the waterworks.
Any thoughts on that?
So the one perspective that I have come across is that crying makes you more intelligent, because the reason that you cry is because you have sort of pent-up frustration, emotion, and that kind of thing, and it's expressed through tears. And actually, if you express those, you let the pressure off by crying or your eyes watering. Actually, then you can think more clearly. So you could look at it as a positive thing, although I think mostly people want to avoid crying in the office. But in my experience, it is the pent-up frustration and the lack of ability to be assertive, and it's the sort of expression of a passive way of dealing with things. And if you can release the pressure by being prepared, being assertive, and rehearsing, practicing with a colleague, then I think that can help a lot. I recently had a situation that I felt quite emotional about, but I didn't want to cry in dealing and talking to my boss. And so I talked to somebody else about it, and he really helped me to be able to articulate my points clearly, and not for the emotion to rise to the surface. And therefore I was able to control that, the fact that I might have, in other circumstances, ended up with my eyes watering.
Okay, I just got, I am biased against it. Anyone that cries in public in a business situation, I feel that they lose credibility. But I like the idea that it's more intelligent to keep the pressure off in private, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's that importance of practice, isn't it? Because I know certainly a lot of women that I've coached who become emotional about certain difficult situations. They've cried when they've been with me, but then they've been able to go into the real situation and handle it in a much more objective way and come across in a more assertive way too. So there's some good thoughts there. So do we have any more questions? Helen, we have a question from yourself.
Hi, yes, I'm Helen Mynette. I've enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much. I have a question around the executive presence, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts and experience about how that translates itself into different cultures. So, for example, my company has a very big presence in India, and I just wonder how my appearance and communication and gravitas may work for me in the UK, but how that gets translated into a different culture and into different countries.
Excellent question, Helen. So anybody would like to offer some thoughts on that, cultural differences?
I can't speak, this is Kate here, I can't speak to India, other than knowing within the bank where we had certain areas of geography which had high ethnic minority levels. We had to think carefully about the staff that we put into those branches because of our customer base and who they would work with and have as their relationship manager and who they wouldn't. So we certainly had some cultural challenges to handle there. I have worked in South Africa, and I maybe not on the same level, but I did have to overcome some preconceptions there when I first arrived. But I think it's just about applying all of the things that Liz has spoken about before in terms of communication, gravitas, and how we behave. And I think as long as we are clear on our personal brand and what that is, any preconceptions seem to disappear once the people started to work with me, certainly in my situation, because the actions spoke louder than any of the words, really. So I had to maybe get past some of those preconceptions in early meetings, but quite quickly I managed to get them to a point where they were willing to work with me. But I did have to be aware of some of the cultural challenges before I arrived.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have time just for one more question. If there are any, Lisa Reynolds-Jones, you have a question for us.
Thanks very much for including me today. I've found it really fascinating and insightful. Clearly it's a focus really on sort of women working together to think about how we can accelerate gender parity. But have you seen a trend sort of swinging the other way in terms of seeing men taking the leadership and ownership for this topic?
Well, I'll jump in before anybody else does. Well, everyone else is thinking, but again, when I was in the bank, we had a big focus on gender parity, and we had a group that was put together, a think tank really, to to look at what the issues were, and it was run by a man. And quite a few people raised an eyebrow at that and said, well, this is a gender issue. Why have you got a man running that? But he volunteered to do it because he was so passionate about getting equality and recognising the value that everybody brings to it. And I think that was an interesting approach to take, because Rosie and I were chatting this morning and saying this isn't about men versus women. It's not about it being a competition. We're trying to get to a point where everybody wins. And so that was a great response. We in our gender groups had men and women coming along because they were interested in the issues regardless of their own particular gender. So certainly I have seen an increase in that.
Good, thank you, Kate. That brings us towards the end of our time together. It seems to have gone very quickly, actually. I could carry on talking about this for a lot longer. But I think, let's just not forget that equality brings economic prosperity, it brings productivity, it brings higher GDP. Fabulous survey which was conducted recently by Ernst & Young. They surveyed 400 global organisations, and 64% of high-performing companies reported that having men and women and having that gender parity had a huge influence on their strategy and their success. So I think we've had some really interesting thoughts and ideas and nuggets of wisdom today to help us all to go out and do our bit, make our pledge for gender parity. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and if you would like to know any more, I've put some contact details up there on the screen. Do feel free to contact any of us, and let's really make sure we move from just talking about it to purposeful action. So happy International Women's Day. Thank you so much for being with us. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I trust you have too. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye-bye for now.